Hello. I'm going to try to deliver a little bit of instruction, a book called America by a man named John Stewart. This applies to all of my social studies classes. I may have to edit some of this as I read it, but it's basically in a text-style format. It's to the huddled masses, keep yearning. That's the dedication on this book. I'm going to skip the foreword. I read it a couple times already. I'll just tell you that it was written by Thomas Jefferson, but not actually written by Thomas Jefferson, but in from his perspective. And it's basically just saying that we gave you a good constitution and you can make changes to it if you need to, and that it's all about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The first chapter, well, here's a breakdown of the chapters, but the first chapter in the book is entitled Democracy Before America. So it's going to talk and probably make fun of democracy from the perspective of world history, but it also relates to contemporary studies, and it relates to civics, and it also relates to geography. So I think this will be a fitting book for us to read together. I hope we can make it through this book before the end of the school year. Democracy Before America. It is often said that America invented democracy. The view of this view is, of course, an understatement. America invented not only democracy, but freedom, justice, liberty, and time sharing. That's kind of a joke. But representative democracy is unquestionably our proudest achievement, the creation most uniquely our own, even if the rest of the Western world would have come up with the idea themselves by the 1820s. So why then has participation in this most wondrous system withered? Okay, there's a couple things it's saying there. First, it's saying that we don't have democracy exactly. Democracy means that we would vote in a direct democracy. We would vote on a law directly ourselves. We would participate. We would be the lawmakers. In a representative democracy, which is what we have, we select people who then meet and they vote and make the laws on our behalf. So we have representatives who practice democracy, and that's called representative democracy. As heirs to a legacy no more than 2 centuries old, it is understandable why present-day Americans would take their own democracy for granted. A president freely chosen from a wide open field of 2 men every 4 years, a Congress with 99% incumbency rate. Incumbency means you come back for more. It means that you keep coming back. People now do argue quite often, and for good reason, that they should limit terms on senators and representatives because they become career politicians, which that statistic would definitely support that. A Supreme Court comprised of 9 politically appointed judges. Politically appointed means that whoever's president gets to pick who gets to be on the Supreme Court, and that's important. Whose only oversight is the icy scythe of death. All these reveal a system fully capable of maintaining itself. But our perfect democracy, which neither needs nor particularly wants voters, is a rarity. That's in jest. It is important to remember there still exist many other forms of government in the world today, and that dozens of foreign countries still long for a democracy such as ours to be imposed upon them. To regain our sense of perspective and wonder, we must take a broader historical view, looking beyond America's relatively recent success story to examine our predecessors and their adorable failures. In this chapter, we will briefly explore the evolution of an idea following the HMS Democracy on her dangerous voyage through the mists of time, past the straits of monarchy, surviving Hurricane Theocracy, then navigating around the Cape of Good feudal system to arrive battered but safe at her denied port of call, America Town. So that's got a lot of fun stuff in it. It's talking about that we had kings, then we had rule by the church, and then we navigated through the feudal system, which would be like lords, and they have serfs or slaves in the feudal system. Of course, there was a feudal system in Japan, there was a feudal system in Europe, but we go on. Early man, more animal than political. So that's another joke. The feeble and weak realized that without a good plan, they weren't going to make it out of the Stone Age to see the wonder that was clay. The human race is by nature brutal, amoral, unreasonable, and self-centered. Well, that's according to this. It's not according to me. But for the first few 100,000 years of our existence as a species, we were way too obvious about it. Primitive cultures centered on survival of the individual and occasionally survival of someone the individual might want to reproduce with. Civic institutions were non-existent, as was debate, which would appear later after the invention of the frontal lobe. For prehistoric man, the rule of law, such as it was, could best be summed up by the seminal case, Mayberry's Head versus Madison's Rock. That's a play on words from Mayberry versus Madison's Supreme Court decision, which established that the Supreme Court had power relative to legislative action, meaning that if it's not kosher according to the Constitution, then a law is not valid. Early man lived this tenuous Darwinian nightmare for an age or two until a particular thing happened. The unfittest decided they wouldn't mind surviving either. The feeble and weak realized that without a good plan, they weren't going to make it out of the Stone Age to see the wonder that was clay. Alone, they were mammoth meat. Together, they would become a force with a chance to see the day when their children's children would be only 75% covered in hair. That's funny. From these noble impulses, the groundwork of the first civilization was laid. Ancient Greece. It is widely credited with creating the world's first democracy. It would be a worthy endeavor to travel back in time to the feta-strewn shores of 5th century BC Athens and ask Plato to define democracy, and not just to make money gambling on Olympics results that we, being from the future, would already know. Pluto would tell us, in that affectionate but sexual way that of his that democracy is a Greek word combining the roots for people, demos, and rule, kata. In Greek democracy, political power was concentrated not in the hands of one person or even in a small group of people, but rather evenly and fairly distributed among all the people. That's where I was talking about direct democracy earlier. Meaning that John Q. Populus could play a role in American government. The main legislative body, the Assembly, was comprised of no less than the first 6,000 citizens to arrive at its meetings, and bear in mind no saving seats. Jury duty was considered an honor to be vied for. Membership in most other civic institutions, including the Supreme Court, were chosen by lot. Imagine a system in which anyone could wind up serving on the Supreme Court. Anyone. Think about your own family friends, the guys you knew in college who would eat dog feces or for $10. Now picture one of them as your randomly chosen Chief Justice, and you'll appreciate just how messed up this system was. Of course, I think that's making fun of things the way they are too. Compared with American democracy, the Athenian version seems simplistic, naive. Transcripts of early Athenian policy debates reveal a populace moved more by eloquence and rationality than by demagogues and fear-mongering. Thankfully, this type of humane governance wasn't allowed to take root. Athens' great experiment ended after less than 2 centuries. That's 200 years. When in 338 BC, Philip of Macedon's forces invaded the city, inflicting on its inhabitants the eternal fate of the noble and enlightened, to be brutally crushed by the armed and dumb. Rome, the first republicans. The fall of Athens was followed by the emergence overnight of Rome. At first glance, its people appear to have enjoyed a system of representative government similar to ours. True, behind its facade of allegedly... here's a timeline of democracy. Memorize it, rewrite it, email me a copy. Just kidding. We'll just go on. You can pause it and look at it a little bit, but I don't think that's going to be anything of that much interest. Officials lurked de facto oligarchy ruled by entrenched plutocrats. And when we say oligarchy, you mean ruled by a few people. But the similarities don't end there. So it's basically saying that we have an oligarchy in the United States, which I sometimes would agree that that's kind of been the case. In fact, the Founding Fathers borrowed many of their ideas from the Roman model, including its bicameral legislature. Bicameral means 2 houses. So we got the Senate, we got the U.S. House of Representatives. Its emphasis on republicanism and civic virtue, and its Freudian fascination with big white columns. That's kind of funny. However, there was very little real democracy in Rome. While the Senate theoretically represented the people, in reality, its wealthy members covertly persuaded pro-business legislation on behalf of such military-industrial giants as Javelin Corp., United Crucifix, and a cartel of resource-exploiting companies known as Big Aqueduct. That's really kind of funny. You never thought about it. You had the plebeians and you had the patricians, and what they're saying is that the patricians were really the rulers. They even monopolized the most notorious aspect of Roman life, instituting a policy that can literally be described as trickle down. We won't go there, whatever that means. Vomitoriums aside, Rome's, you know what a vomitorium is, where you can throw up after you ate too much, so you can eat more. Rome's biggest contribution to American government was probably its legal system, which codified key concepts like equal protection, innocent until proven guilty, and the right to confront one's accusers. These very same issues would later form the basis of both the Bill of Rights and the mind-numbing quantity of law and order scripts. But by the time of Rome's huge millennium celebration marking the beginning of 0 AD, the faint light of Roman democracy was all but extinguished. The Republic had given way to empire. The only voting to speak of took place in the Colosseum and was generally limited to a handful of disembowelment-related issues. I don't know what that means. In time, the empire itself fell, as history teaches us all. Empires inevitably must. Its most enduring legacy, a numerical system that allowed future generations to more easily keep track of Super Bowls. Because they're saying, you use Roman numerals for Super Bowls. Haha, that's very funny. This is a chart, a page of philosophical roots of the American democracy. That's another part that you could maybe pause on, and if you want to look at it a little bit more and read it some, I guess it's interesting. I'm sure it is. So you've got Plato, John Locke, and I can't say his name, Nicholas, and then you have Christ. What type of government best suits you? The Magna Carta, power to the extremely wealthy people. The Magna Carta was a document that was written, forced on King George, I think, based on his abuse of powers, and basically it said that you're not going to do that anymore, and there's going to be somebody else that has a say-so in the making of laws, and let's just read about it. And then darkness. For more than 1,000 years, democracy disappeared from the European scene. The period instead saw the blossoming of an exciting array of alternate forms of government, such as monarchy, absolute monarchy, kingship, queenhood, and 3 different types of oppression, religious, ethnic, and giggles. As for individual liberty, innocent until proven guilty was rapidly supplanted by a more aggressive law and order approach better characterized as guilty until proven flammable. I guess they're kind of a reference to the witch burning. I'm not sure. Democracy had disappeared. The people needed a champion, and as is usually the case, the obscenely rich rode to the rescue. In 1215, England's wealthy barons refused to give King John, King John was the one, not King George, King John the money he needed to wage war unless he signed the Magna Carta. The document codified that no man was above the law. So that's the rule of law. Unfortunately for the present class, it did little to address how many were below it. Startlingly ahead of its time, this extraordinary document had a profound effect on people and continues to shape 21st century views on topics as diverse as I don't know what these are, and the bailiwicks of Gerald. But even more importantly, the Magna Carta set a powerful precedent for our own founding fathers. There were no more powerful means of safeguarding individual liberty than a vaguely worded manifesto inked in inscrutable cursive with dilapidated parchment. So it was saying, you write, make a document like that. It's gonna be important. So you have to have good handwriting and old parchment. The Magna Carta served as a wake-up call that Europe would be forced to answer in about 500 years. For Lady Democracy, having lain dormant for more than a millennium, had risen from its slumber only to stretch its arms, reach for the clock, and groggily set the snooze bar for the Enlightenment. The 17th and 18th centuries enlightening strikes. Enlightening strikes. That's a play on lightning strikes. I don't know. Let's just see what it says. Though a promising development for democracy, the Magna Carta was mostly ignored as the world plunged into what the world would be known as the Dark Ages. It was an apt title for an era where dysentery was considered the good kind of dysentery. Oppression and the high mortality rates seemed ready to swallow what remained of mankind, when through the darkness emerged the light that would be its salvation. Reason, it began slowly. Hey, what if we stopped storing the corpses in the drinking water and see if that makes any difference to our health? From there, it gathered momentum. Soon, all conventional wisdom, from the shape of the earth to whether the ruling class could have your hut burned and your organs removed because they thought you caused an eclipse, was up for grabs. This last question proved especially pertinent for the future of democracy and ushered in an era known as the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason, would finally provide democracy with its philosophical underpinnings. The 17th and 18th century produces a wave of prominent thinkers espousing political systems based on what they call the social contract. Government, they theorized, was a sort of legal agreement between the rulers and the ruled, the terms of which were binding on both parties. It was a groundbreaking theory. All they needed now was some country dumb enough to try it before the king found out and had them all drawn and quartered. Democracy needed a fresh start. Hardy and idealistic champions who would strike out for a new world, willing to risk for the principles of equality, liberty, justice, and slaves. We'd need some slaves and guns, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. A new world awaited. Alright, I think that's enough for one lesson. I thought I was going to make it through a whole section. Oh, I did make it through the whole chapter. I didn't make it through a breakdown of the ages of democracy, a guide, but you're welcome to freeze the frame and read that a little bit. I don't know if you can see it all or not. We'll find out. This is my first time delivering this way, and we're going to see how that works. Now, if you lived in a democracy, would you rather be a king or a slave? Why or why not? These are our discussion questions. What is the central ideological difference between democracy and cannibalism? You're a 5th century city-state growing increasingly concerned over repeated Persian incursion into the central Peloponnesian Peninsula. How many hoplites can you dispatch to Thermopylae without jeopardizing the tiresome triremes commanded by, never mind that question. Does the expression, when in Rome, do as the Romans do, apply to all cities or just Rome? I'll let you take a look at that. If there's any, you can freeze it and look at those questions if you want to for fun. But I'm going to stop here. Thank you.